North is not arbitrary. Episode 11. Reinventing North. Life can feel harder than it actually is when people reinvent their own personal north. If a reference point keeps moving and the map keeps changing, direction then becomes a preference, and without a fixed horizon, the body and mind cannot agree on orientation. Inner balance disappears, and a person can feel upright while slowly tilting. It takes time for a self-invented system to collapse. This is what happens when someone invents or follows a false map. It either depicts territory that does not exist or denies terrain that does. Sometimes it is not entirely wrong, just off or incomplete. A false map is any belief system that promises an outcome that cannot be delivered. Welcome to Hell is a Latitude-Longitude. Latitude and longitude are not based on preference. Instead, it is based upon an astronomical reality, and functions effectively because it is supported by Earth's true sphere rotation. The Earth spins on a fixed axis that links to a North Pole and a South Pole. These are structural poles, not just symbolic. They create a measurement system that aligns with reality itself, and that alignment is what allows positions to be accurately determined. This same principle also applies to spiritual latitude-longitude. North creates maps, and if the grid were arbitrary, navigation would collapse into chaos. Direction exists before opinion ever enters the room. On the moral compass, God is true north. That is because the whole of existence is already oriented toward Him as the source of life. And true north is not arbitrary. Yet two people can both claim belief in God and still move in opposite directions. The primary reason people diverge in life is the type of underlying moral structure they are obeying. People discover the contours of the Godhead from different observation points. The reason people spiritually drift is not because they reject God, but because the word God is interchangeable with any meaning, a vague label that can be assigned to any conceivable personality or ideal. Power is a trait often treated as a god. Preference can be elevated to the divine, and even desire can be given a sacred title. This creates a serious problem for spiritual navigation, because whatever a person worships becomes the model they imitate. A person, often unconsciously, carries the image of God quietly and shapes what they call good, permissible, or justified. And over time, you become just like the object of your worship. For that reason, worship is not neutral. It trains the imagination, shapes permission, and pulls direction. Over time, you do not just serve what you worship, you resemble it. This is why any serious seeker must examine the character of the God they follow, not just emotionally, but structurally. Ask questions such as, what does this God govern? What does this God permit? And what does this God excuse? Because alignment happens by imitation. Even if their model of God is flawed, their imitation will continue on a crooked path. Universally, moral principles behave consistently and stabilize regardless of belief. Responsibility restores trust, and truth-bearing behavior strengthens communities. These patterns do not just depend on belief. They emerge from motives functioning as behavioral law. Moral reality does not wait for agreement. It responds to behavior the same way gravity responds to motion. If God is allowed to remain vague, then orientation will collapse. Worship is unavoidable, and as a result, people simply start imitating whatever model is nearest. This is called authority confusion. This is one reason it matters to know where true north is, because worship is a part of our nature to orient devotion toward something. Whether it is called worship or not, every person organizes their life around their highest value. Worship, at its core, is sustained attention combined with imitation directed toward what a person treats as ultimate. By that definition, everyone worships. Spiritual drift happens because the word God or worship is allowed to become vague. When the reference point drifts, something else quietly takes its place. Preference can become a god. Safety can become a god. Even the self can be worshipped. Each of these set permission to justify behavior and promise outcome. And each imitate and alignment happens by imitation. You do not move toward what you claim to believe, but toward what you actually worship. Whatever sits at the top of your image hierarchy becomes the model you unconsciously reproduce. That's why two people can both speak about God, but are oriented toward two different models. Knowing where true north is does not make a person perfect. It just helps to make correction possible. Because once the reference is clear, imitation stops drifting and alignment can finally begin. Long before the concept of human rights entered modern government, humanity had already organized itself around a structure of worship, the law of force. Permission came from any authority, enforcement came through violence, and possession belonged to whoever could take over, a pattern that repeats through history. When a ruler desired more land, wealth, or control, they did not debate morality. They imposed it. Violence justified itself, and power excused its own excess. Punishment became a tool of dominance rather than justice. Empires rose by force and fell by force, and in their wake, conquerors, kings, and rulers consistently left the same trail: misery, instability, and destruction. The law of force functions as a false north, promising order but producing chaos, thus claiming stability but generating endless conflict. The law of force rewards dominance and punishes restraint, and when force becomes north, violence becomes virtue. As Genghis Khan confiscated the spoils, did he say, "Please," prior to the slaughter? Did the Vikings say, "Thank you," after raiding Iceland? The repugnant treatment experienced by their poor victims would rival any horror movie. As each powerful kingdom ended, little was left to admire of their creed of greed. What you have, I can take. They roared in, the bully rule. It was God, true north, who whispered in the golden rule. God's demand for fairness blasted louder than a cannon, and the edge of his patience cut deeper than a sword. Without a fixed moral, true north, power becomes the compass and the needle just spins. A false north happens when the governing structure is wrong, and when fools are allowed to speak as authorities. These mechanical structures naturally collapse under their own design. In navigational terms, force-based systems create false maps. When power replaces reference, direction becomes whoever is strongest in the moment. This guarantees cycles of violence and chronic instability. A reinvented north becomes self-destructive. When north is reinvented as might makes right, it eventually consumes the one using it. Because force has no stopping principle. When force becomes the highest authority, there's no internal break, no concept of enough, no restraint, no boundary that cannot be crossed. So, the system must constantly escalate. What begins as control turns into domination. What begins as protection ends up aggression. And what starts as survival erodes into compulsion. In the end, the escalation does not remain external. Because force does not have the capacity to regulate itself, it eventually turns inward on the one wielding it. Force trains the nervous system to harm and conditions the body and mind to associate intensity with meaning. Under force-based orientation, dominance becomes safety and destruction is mistaken for control. Over time, calm begins to feel empty and restraint feels weak. Reinventing North will sabotage stability by provoking conflict and rewards escalation. And when impact replaces alignment as the signal of meaning, the system turns inward. That is the definition of self-harm. Force fractures and splits a person. It splits thought from conscience, emotion from restraint, and action from meaning. And because chaos is contrary to our inherited nature, the result is a silenced conscience where empathy is erased and fear is weaponized. Worst yet, the person will burn out, addicted to rage cycles, and numbness takes over. Evidence of structural fatigue, the system is tearing itself apart from within. A false north removes the horizon because everything becomes adversarial. Without a stable reference, misalignment is no longer just off course, it becomes opposition. So instead of reorienting, the system doubles down. This is why self-destructive patterns persist even when the damage is obvious. The internal navigation system can no longer detect level. A person can feel upright even when tilting, and when force has no external opponent left, it turns inward. This is not a new discovery, it is what every civilization eventually rediscovers. All self-harm is motion without direction. Whether it shows up as addiction, reckless behavior, relational sabotage, or literal physical harm, it follows the same structure. Because force replaces alignment and pain replaces guidance, inevitably the self pays the price. Any personal reinvention of North eventually demands a sacrifice, and the nearest available offering is the person using it. Force never stops at enemies. When it runs out of external targets, it turns inward. There are no breaks. Thus, violence is an orientation that cannot sustain life. You do not heal by applying more force to a broken compass. Healing happens when you eliminate the distortion and the system is allowed to return to its natural alignment. The moment you stop reinventing your own personal north is the moment you admit, I cannot tell if I'm level anymore, and is when the true horizon can return. The question becomes, if force fails as north, then how do I find true north? True north is identified through an alignment test by examining outcomes, not ideals. True north produces repeatable, life-giving results over time. Life flourishes wherever it comes into correspondence with the Godhead. True north forms an environment that will reduce internal conflicts, that does not require constant justification or defense. True north verifies itself by what it produces. Test for non-negotiability. If something only works when it benefits you, that is preference. Look for restraint. True north feels quietly firm. You relax within it. Your conscience functions as a sensor instrument. When aligned, it produces peace. When misaligned, it produces tension that does not go away. Listen to it. In repose, when moral principles are seen clearly, our nature recognizes them. When they are articulated, our reason confirms them. Alignment does not feel foreign, it feels familiar. When true north moral principles are encountered, our nature identifies with them. When heard, reason lays claim to them, and by association, our power of oneness interlocks with them. That is because moral principles are not invented, they resonate as a fit to our nature. Principles governing decent behavior emerge wherever truth is honored, through scripture, prophets, religious traditions, or passed along by any heart humming its song. Oneness has a peaceful link back to the source of life, and this explains why truth feels like coming home. It is a natural highland we are familiar with, but over time have lost sight of it. The return of the prodigal son is a journey of completed autonomy. Life can tolerate exploration because the Godhead remains fixed. And when correction is chosen instead of enforced, truth becomes internalized. When your true core is at rest, thoughts, emotions, and behavior stop fighting each other. True unity emerges when alignment with the source produces outcomes that compensate for everyone, recognized through the lawful patterns it produces. Thank you for listening to Hell is a Latitude-Longitude.